Good morning, everyone. We're still looking at Samson this morning. A couple last things to talk about in chapter 15, and then we'll move on to chapter 16. So you'll remember last week we talked about how Samson and the Philistines have been escalating this conflict between them. Samson married this Philistine woman, and then ran off to go settle the bet that he had made. And due to some level of confusion / Samson not acting in a particularly predictable or mature way, it is thought that he is abandoning his new wife and does not want to be married to her, so she's given over to somebody else, given over to the best man of the wedding to make our lovely soap opera complete. And so that becomes more reason to escalate the conflict. Samson says, this time I will be blameless. This time it is okay for me to do harm to the Philistines because of what they have done to me. And he takes those 300 foxes, ties their tails in pairs and a torch with each pair, and sends them running through the fields of grain, the stacked up grain that had just been harvested, and the olives as well. And there's great loss. One thing we didn't mention last week was this situation is somehow actually addressed in the old law. Maybe not with the foxes that way, but in Exodus 22:6, it says, "If fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that the stacked grain or standing grain or the field is consumed, he who started the fire shall make full restitution." Now, dealing with Philistine fields here, so it is a little bit different, but I did think that it was at least interesting that this situation is addressed for somebody who has accidentally or maliciously started a fire that has caused this great harm to the fields owned by somebody else and the grain owned by somebody else, that God recognized that is something that needs to be fixed. It's something that needs to be paid restitution for. So the Philistines become very angry about this, understandably, and they decide to kill the woman and her father, her family. Instead of going after Samson, they go after the woman that he is trying to be married to, tried to marry, whatever the situation is there. And this just escalates the conflict even more. Samson went back and slaughtered many Philistines in a fit of rage. We also mentioned that Samson he goes and runs to hide because the Philistines are coming after him, and the people of Judah are scared because the Philistines are raiding. The Philistines are getting a lot more aggressive and going to bring a lot more pain upon the Israelites. And so the people of Judah come after Samson as well and say, what have you done? Why did you do this to us? Why did you make the Philistines so angry? We're in grave danger because of this. And so they tie him up and send him over to the Philistines. But of course, he's able to break out of those bonds. And he grabs the fresh jawbone of a donkey, which is like the third improvised weapon that we find within the book of Judges. And he takes that and slaughters 1,000 men of the Philistines who are trying to capture him. And then Samson takes all the credit, and this is where we left off last time, he takes all the credit for this victory as being his own power. He has kind of this taunting song for the Philistines in verse 16, where he says, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men." And if you contrast that to something, it's like a spider web or something right in my face. Sorry, it's very distracting. Okay. If you contrast that with the Song of Deborah, right? The Song of Deborah does pay some honor to the soldiers who fought valiantly and to, Deborah who led them. But it also pays a lot of honor to God for overcoming their enemies. And Samson does not say any of that. Samson doesn't do more than just taunt them and say, I've beaten you with the jawbone of a donkey. Look how weak you are and how strong I am. Really up to this point, and this is about to change, but up to this point, we might not even know that Samson knows anything about God whatsoever. Nothing he has done makes any sort of implication that he knows God, thinks about God, cares about the covenant. He has not talked to God so far. He has not cared anything for this Nazirite vow. He has not acted in any kind of righteous way. Nothing good has happened so far, and there's no evidence up to this point of any kind of relationship with God, weak or strong. It's kind of a scary situation. But in the verses that are coming up, we'll see that he does start talking to God, and that conversation is interesting. So he throws away the jawbone out of his hand, and in verse 18 we read, "And he was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" I think there's a few ways that we can take that. Like, on one hand, that does seem good. It seems better than what we've seen so far. That he has finally recognized something about God, and he is willing to give some kind of credit to God here. It says that it's God who granted this salvation, by Samson's hand. That's different than what he said in the song. But at the same time, he's also not really humbling himself before God. He's saying, shall I now die of thirst? You need to do something for me. You've given this great victory. Now don't abandon me in the wilderness. Don't let me die of thirst and fall into the hands of the Philistines. So I get much more of an angry tone here than I do a humble and submissive tone, particularly with what we've seen out of Samson so far. But this is at least something, some recognition that God exists and that God was involved in some way in this. Like I said, up to this point, we wouldn't know that he even knew who God was. So God does provide that water for him. Opened up a hollow place there. Water came out of it. Samson was revived, and he got a little summation statement again that we see at the end of each one of these chapters. He judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. There is some irony to that, because in what way is Samson judging Israel? Has much happened? Even if we take the broader definition of judging, like we've been doing in this book, that it doesn't have to be legal judging, but more delivering, leading the people into battle, leading the people toward greater righteousness. Samson is not leading anyone into battle except for himself. And he's not calling upon anybody to be righteous. He's not even really calling upon himself to be righteous. So the only real sense in which he is judging Israel is that he is fighting against the Philistines for his own purposes, and God is using that to deliver Israel. This is a very different kind of judging than the previous ones that we had before. It has certainly fallen a long way. All that brings us to chapter 16. But you have anything else through the end of 15? Yes, Dave.
I understand about Samson, going on his own, everything that happened to him. But I think the water, in my opinion, is that it had to have reminded God that Samson
Right.
So he was said he was dying, right, thirsty. I guess you would be pretty thirsty if you don't know it. But, God is the one who did it. And had to have made him think about it. Had to. Because that didn't come out of anywhere.
Right.
So I have another question, though.
Sure.
Back earlier on. It's interesting to see Samson's poor judgment of friends. What kind of companion, best man, would accept his wife?
Good question.
That's betrayal.
Yeah.
I mean, if that happened today, you think that friendship will last?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just interesting to see that, man, these guys are just terrible people. They just don't
Yeah.
even think twice about it.
Yeah. So if you didn't hear what Dave was saying, first he was saying the water being given by God had to have been a reminder for Samson, and I agree. This is really the first time that something has happened that Samson can't ignore. He can fight the Philistines and somehow believe that it's just because he's so strong and it's his own power, even though it's God who's giving him that power. But he didn't stumble across a pool of water somewhere. He asked for help, even if it might have been done angrily, and a hollow in the earth opened up and water came out of it. So that was a clear deliverance from God, a provision from God that had to hit Samson in some new way. So that was an important thing, and I think why God probably provided that for him, even aside from the fact that God had more to do with Samson in the time to come, that also this could be a learning opportunity for Samson. And secondly, that how would Samson's best man be willing to take Samson's wife? Doesn't seem like a very good friend. It's sort of a pragmatic option. If they believed that Samson has abandoned his wife, then she's in a state of dishonor there, right? She's been married off to somebody, but now she doesn't really have a husband, and she's in danger of being alone forever. So I can understand why the father wants to resolve this quickly, and why she might want to resolve this quickly, but from the position of the best man, of the friend there at the wedding, why would he take his friend's wife? That's not a good look at all.
The reason I bring it up is, after all the things that Samson did, I personally would not want to, go against him.
Yeah.
Just smush you like a bug.
Right.
So it just baffles me.
That's a good reason as well. Samson has not made good companions in all of this. With the women nor with the men that he is associated with. He's with a lot of troublemakers and a lot of people who bring him down, and that causes problems. Yeah. Mark.
Yeah, it's interesting. He was not delivered.
Yeah.
Because we see that the Philistines are still a problem, but when David's there, and it's interesting that now they have when Goliath is there, they have a single guy that they're looking to.
Yes.
And that word judge, that he judged Israel, can also just mean to vindicate. And I see Solomon as just being God's kind of justice, because they're oppressing. Sorry? I'm sorry, yeah. Samson is the guy who's doing things on God's behalf.
Yeah.
Regardless of his character and all that.
Yeah.
They are oppressing his people. These people are going to bring the Messiah. This is what all the Old Testament's about. And God doesn't appreciate that these heathens are sullying the name of Jehovah. And I just see Solomon as being that guy. He's not Samson, I'm sorry. But anyway, that's just how I see this whole thing. I see God making contingencies for this guy in a lot of ways.
No, I think you're dead on, because there's when you've gone through the whole book of Judges, you can't get away from the fact that this term judge is really shifting in meaning as time goes on. What happened at the beginning of the book of Judges is not the same as what's happening at the end of the book of Judges. It's very much on purpose. We're seeing declining character, but also declining outcomes. And we've transitioned from the Israelites not even really asking for help anymore, which is what we had on the last one, and God delivering them anyway, to now this time they're not asking for help, and the deliverance isn't really a deliverance anymore. It doesn't say that he delivered them. This escalated conflict, and it started a lot more of a war between Israel and Philistia, but it's not really a deliverance. And that's true even when we get to the end of chapter 16. The Philistines are not beaten back. They are, Israel is not freed from that oppression. It's just been escalated, and the Philistines have been dealt a heavy blow. So, chapter 16, yes, Betty.
I have an observation only.
Yeah.
In verses 1 through 3, it talks about heart, but then it goes on to Sorry, and he loves Delilah. So there's no indication really that she was a heart. She was evil. I don't know if he ever married her or didn't marry her, it doesn't say if he did, but he loved her. So it seemed like it was a different relationship sexually than the heart.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think here in chapter 16 that we've got two different women being talked about for a total of 3 within the story. The woman that he has married or has tried to marry, and then the prostitute, and then Delilah. And no indication that Delilah was a prostitute. Also no indication that he married her. Just seems to be a woman he's with for a while. And considering how much detail it went into about him wanting to marry the first woman, it seems like that would have been mentioned if he wanted to marry Delilah. I think we just need to understand that Samson's, controlled by his own lust, that he is bouncing from woman to satisfy that desire, and he's not made good decisions in any of this. So yeah, that's chapter 16, the first bit here. What do we learn about him in these first 3 verses before we get to Delilah, about this prostitute? What do we learn about him? It reads, Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. The Gazites were told, Samson has come here, and they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, let us wait till the light of the morning, then we will kill him. But Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city, and the 2 posts, and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron.
It's possible that the Philistines used it's not very clear, but this is possible that they used her to try to trap Samson.
Yeah, it may have been a trap. The other option there, and it's hard to know either way just because we don't have tons of information, it's either a trap or Samson is just not real subtle and has no desire to even hide what he's doing. I think both of those are plausible because we know the Philistines are angry and want to kill Samson, and we also know that Samson is not real subtle. So either of those could be true, where he has come into Gaza, he's found this prostitute, he doesn't really care about hiding it, and she is going to end up, whether by accident or on purpose, being a trap for him, in that the people of Gaza are going to use that as opportunity to kill him. Now, Gaza, if we want to think about what this is like geographically, Samson has gone pretty deep into Philistia. So he has traveled the length of Philistia to get to Gaza. So he is deep within Philistine territory, which tells me that he's somewhat at home there. Even with all of this conflict, he had no problem finding a wife among the Philistines. He has no problem staying within their land for a long time. This is not like that he popped over, across the border momentarily to find a prostitute. This is, Samson spends a lot of time here in Philistia. And he's content to be here and to look for trouble here, even with people who are trying to kill him. He's got enough arrogance, enough belief in his own power, and enough lust within his heart that he is looking for trouble everywhere that he goes. So here in Gaza, he finds this prostitute, and now they're trying to find a way to kill him. So what about this way that Samson gets out of the situation? Dave?
Before we get to that, can I ask them?
Sure.
Just hit me, after reading this several times, that Samson does what we do when it comes to, he was clearly in sin here, doing this with the heart. I don't know what his depth of belief in God is at this point, but he did know right from wrong.
Yeah.
Right? And too many times, we people, no matter what era they're from, compartmentalize sin. I've seen it. I've experienced it.
Yeah.
We all do it, and some people really do it. Or, God has blessed me with this, 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 but He'll forgive me for that and that and that.
Yeah.
And so I'm just proposing something. I'm not certain. Is it possible that he's doing that very thing and trying to compartmentalize away that sin with the harlot? He knew that he had to have known that was a sinful thing. And
Yeah.
that's just common sense, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm puzzled by that, but I'm not.
Yeah.
Because that's something, and the reason I'm bringing it up is that's something we need to be thinking about, because it happens way too often.
Yeah.
When you talk to someone who's doing something, every time, unfortunately, as elders, when we have to meet with somebody that, thankfully, it's not very frequent, that they always, without doubt, compartmentalize them.
Yeah. I think that's human. Yeah. That's human nature, to compartmentalize, to rationalize, to, on one hand have some level of belief in God, to have some, desire to do what's right. We can quibble over how much that was true for Samson. I don't think we know completely. But whatever he knew about God and whatever he knew about right and wrong, which he did know right and wrong, he is still not expressing any level of self-control with regards to sexual sin, nor with regards to his anger and violence. There is not one case in all of this where he de-escalates a situation. Every time somebody makes him mad, he makes it worse. Every time that there's an opportunity for him to find a woman to sleep with, he takes advantage of it. As far as what we are told in the narrative, there's no self-control in Samson's life. So these seem to be things that he is not willing to bring in subjection to God. So if he has any kind of belief in God, any kind of subjection to him, these are parts of his life that he has compartmentalized as not necessary to control. And unfortunately, that is something that we can still do today.
Well, he isn't a person of strong consideration. He doesn't think about the things he does.
No.
Even going back to giving his parents the honey he took out of a carcass,
Yeah.
because that would have been abhorrent to them.
Right.
He has no thought process of what he's doing, or he just does whatever his sensual nature feels like doing.
Yeah.
Without consideration for others, without consideration for God. I think God's using it to a purpose,
Sure.
just as he used Pharaoh
Mm-hmm.
and other characters that we've seen, but he's using the nature of Samson.
Yeah.
And Samson's nature is thoughtless and
Yeah.
self-centered and willful, and he has no thought of recrimination for anybody or for anybody.
Yeah, he's very much moment by moment. Whatever seems right in this moment, whatever I feel strongly, you can tell he feels strongly about most everything that happens. But there's no consideration, there's no filter to his actions or words. He just does the next thing that he feels. This is a portrait of a man who is ruled by sin. This is the end state of someone who has let sin grow and grow in his life, not struggling with some problems, but just completely unrestrained. He does whatever he wants to do. Mark?
Yeah, it's interesting what he does with this gate and his doors and,
Yeah.
he's not killing anybody. Why does he do it? It doesn't say that he was told about the plot to come, he just does it. And I don't know, maybe just to show his strength, that God is with him, I don't know. But when I look at, by law, this Nazarite vow, he's not a Nazarite. But when the Nazarite conditions are given to his mother and father, it's by God, and it doesn't include all those other things. So I don't know, again, I've said this a couple of times, this is outside the law, in my opinion, that God makes a special circumstance just because he's doing God's bidding.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right there. And then, he's certainly not worked to keep any of it. So the question of is he a Nazarite or is he bound to his vows? Certainly God is not happy with the choices that Samson is making. That much is clear. But exactly the nature of this vow, it certainly seems to be some kind of edge case due to the factors we mentioned last week about that. But what Samson has done here in walking out and picking up the gate and the posts for it and the bar that's over the post, that's unimaginably heavy. That would all be closed up for the night, so nobody can get in really, but it would also prevent anyone from getting out. And Samson just picks up the whole structure and walks off with it. Presumably it's connected to a wall. That doesn't seem to be an obstacle for him. And so he's ripped that from the wall, he's ripped that out of the ground, and he's carrying it out. I'm kind of struck by how pointless that is. Because if all you need to do is leave the city, then all you need to do is break down the gate in some way. So if he's strong enough to rip it all out of the ground and carry it some distance, it seems like he's strong enough to just break through it. Or even if he's going to rip it out of the ground to show his strength, then he can set it aside and go. But out of some crazy stubbornness, he just carries it some distance. We don't know how far, but he's heading towards Hebron, and he carries it up a hill, sets it up on that hill, and goes. I think he's just throwing a tantrum. I don't know how else to read that he's either gotten word that they're trying to kill him and he's trying to intimidate them, or he just wants to leave a path of destruction there in the city. He's come, he's seen this prostitute, and now he wants to scare them half to death by, what kind of man can rip the gate out from the ground. It's a bizarre circumstance to me. I don't know, maybe you have a better explanation for that than I do. Dave?
Well, thought occurred to me, what's been going on here? God's trying to get him to see that he's in control.
Yeah.
It was no accident that rock split and water came out of it.
Yeah.
Could it be that God wanted to show Samson who gave him the strength to pull that up there? Because that's not something that anybody ever, even the fabled Hercules, could ever do.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that is or isn't right, but
don't
it just
know.
seems peculiar. God gave him that strength,
Yeah.
and he continued to give him that strength.
Yeah.
for times.
Right.
I'm just wondering if this is something God is trying to get him to realize. I don't know. It just seems kind of, I don't think anything is pointless.
Yeah.
So, you know what I'm saying?
No, I follow you. there's something that's being accomplished here beyond the strict necessity of getting out of town. If that's all he's trying to accomplish, he doesn't need to do this. So yeah, I think in all of the cases where Samson is showing this great level of strength, that God is trying to show him, hey, look how I am blessing you, look what I am giving to you. And even though we don't have the phrase that we've had in the past, that the Spirit of the Lord has come into Samson and has given him this power, I find it completely impossible to believe that did not happen here, because there's no way that Samson would have been able to do this by himself. And remembering what we know, that the Philistines are working hard to try to figure out how Samson has this power, he must not have looked particularly strong. He must not have looked like a bodybuilder, world champion, lifter. He must have looked more normal, and yet he is showing this great strength. And so this needs to be something that they and Samson realize has come from God, but they're all missing it up to this point. Oh, yes, Gary.
One thing we can't get away from is Hebrews 11 calls Samson a man of faith.
Yeah.
So that's a clear explanation of at least who he was, or part of who he was.
Yeah.
And he was born to deliver the Philistines.
Right.
It says clearly before he was born.
Yeah.
He's going to be born to deliver the Philistines. I wonder if the fact that they weren't delivered clearly or for long or whatever has to do with his character.
Yeah.
The mistakes he made. That we kind of analyze that.
Right.
He's born delivered, but the delivery wasn't
Yeah.
very much. So
Right.
maybe there has to. God does work with
Mm-hmm.
normal human beings with weaknesses.
Yeah, so, that makes Hebrews 11 interesting, because you go through the list, and traditionally, and this is the way that I've explained it many times, we talk about Hebrews 11 as being a hall of fame of the most faithful people that the world has ever seen. And I don't know, going through some of these, that makes me doubt that explanation to some degree. Because, we've got Barak in that list. He was faithful, but flawed, for sure. We have Jephthah in that list, who was worse than Barak and does not have a great understanding of God, making these very rash vows. We have Samson, who, if he has faith, we're having to try to reconstruct it and try to infer where that faith might be, whereas we don't have to infer where his flaws are. His flaws are very evident. So, kind of wonder if that makes the point of Hebrews 11 more about how that God works through, the faith like the grain of mustard seed that is very powerful even with a small amount of faith, and that, sure, people like Moses and David and these others, were great instruments in God's hand with their faith, and even people with very small amounts of faith were also used by God in different ways, but not necessarily being a judgment of these are the world's best followers of God that have ever existed. I think that might be missing the mark, knowing what we know.
Well, there's a big question as to whether Saul, who became Paul, was somebody who could be trusted to be a man of God and spread the gospel.
Yeah.
It was unlikely.
Right.
And I think when you look back through the Bible, God used the unlikely so many times.
Yes.
Which really gives more credibility to the scripture, because he used them and it worked to his purpose.
Right.
And Samson, spoilers, he will achieve the purpose God gave for him, whether really what he wanted to or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure at any point that Samson wanted to accomplish God's will. He ends up accomplishing God's will, but really only because God is using him.
I think he ends up with faith.
he didn't start out with faith, but I think he ends up that way. And it talks about, Ezekiel, I think, talks about person's good and then they change and they're bad.
Sure.
Then that's the way they get judged.
Yeah.
They're bad and then they turn good, and that's the way they get judged. He got judged because of his final faith.
Sure.
It wasn't something he had all his life.
Yeah, that concept very, very valid. I still have questions about Samson even in his last moments there. We'll get there, but ultimately God's the judge of that for sure. You know, we don't need to try to make the decision on, you know, where Samson's going to end up or anything like that. But it is interesting to see how an extremely flawed man like Samson is still being used by God to some great degree. Okay, we had a bunch of hands up, so Mark and then Lito.
Yeah, there's all kinds of levels of faith. You see that.
Yeah.
You see the entirety of Israel's discipline change in the desert and the faith become greater. And the point of Hebrews 11 is what he says in chapter 12, that Jesus is the perfecter of faith.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, Lito?
Yeah, it just shows you that when God wants to show His power right away, He will show. It doesn't matter what time or when it's needed. I'm not forgetting that He delivered the Israelites so many times, and this is one time,
Yeah.
part of the time that God delivers the Israelites.
Right.
And the Word of God is kind of clears out all the possibility of anything that is being taken by man. Remember, the birth of Samson came from a barren woman.
Yeah.
And then there was a word that his strength would come from his. So there's no question that God shows the power whenever it's necessary, whenever what time it is. That kind of situation to do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Betty?
And his exhibitions of his strength put fear into the heart of the Philistines.
Right.
And this went on, this didn't just happen at one time. It
Right.
went on and on. They were scared to death. And I think that was all for a purpose, all part of God's plan. To get him in the
Yes.
position that he was in to kill all of his people.
Right.
Which we'll get into. But
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, Def?
So, I think your comment about Hebrews 11 is correct. If you go back to Hebrews 11, verse 1, it gives us the definition of faith, right? It's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So, I don't think every example in here is supposed to be the honorable of faith, like you
Right,
said,
yeah.
often not good, but an example of faith.
Yes.
And the faith for Samson, the evidence of things not seen, right, is the fact that his Nazarite vow, don't cut your hair. If not cutting of your hair, I cannot cut my hair and let it really get done.
Right. Yeah.
I can only not cut my hair and get very done when God says that's what will happen.
Right.
And so the power is back to God, right?
Right.
So the faith, I think, is Samson through his entire life, that we use, he's an instrument of God to deliver or judge the Philistines, to keep them at bay so they don't, go conquer Israel as a younger nation, but to keep them at bay. And as long as he is keeping his faith, and perhaps he does have some level of faith from his parents as a child,
Mhm.
there is some evidence back in chapter 13 of that. Yeah, he has no self-control.
Yeah.
But as long as he keeps that Nazarite vow,
Mhm.
he's used as an instrument of God.
Yeah.
And when he does not keep that vow, it's not until his hair grows back that he is able to again be used as an instrument of God to keep the Philistines at bay.
Yeah, it's like he's held on to this one piece of it, this I'm not going to cut my hair, for all the lack of self-control that Samson has. He doesn't cut his hair, and that's a choice that he has made. So if we're finding an inkling of faith somewhere, it's probably got to be in that. I think that's a good observation, that something is keeping him from doing that, and so his strength continues. Very imperfect, but God can still work with that. Yes.
So, that is one thing that's kind of unclear to me. And all the questions of Delilah trying to figure out what his strength is he truly not knowing what his true strength is, or is he just being deceiving?
Oh, he's just being deceiving. Yeah, he's messing with her. He does not want to reveal the source at all. And it shows how little he cares for Delilah, that he'd string her along like this. I mean, you can say, I'm not going to tell you, but this stringing along of giving her, lie after lie after lie is not a particularly kind thing to do. Question 8 is interesting. Why is Delilah even trying to learn the source of Samson's strength? The money. Yeah, how much money was she offered? A lot. 5,500 pieces of silver. I was trying to figure out how much money that would be. That's, it's hard to convert these things, but that's something like tens of millions of dollars today. So, this is an actual fortune.
Mine says 1,100 shekels.
From each.
From each. 1,100 from each of the Philistine kings. So we know there were 5 Philistine kings, yes. So 1,100 from each one, yeah. They said, we'll each give you this. Even the 1,100 would have been an incredible fortune already, but, times 5 makes it too much to resist for her. And so even though she is, involved with Samson here, she's going to try to figure out the source of his strength so that she can get the payout. So, why does God take Samson's strength away? Gary?
He finally told her what would happen if his hair was cut.
Yeah. And they cut off his hair, and that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. This was the last thing that Samson was holding on to in his vow, in his relationship with God, as far as his expression of faith. He gave up even this. This is a low point for him, and so his strength is taken away. Mark?
It's a great lesson for Samson as well. Delilah's name means someone feeble, somebody weak, and
Yeah.
not showing that you're not as strong as you.
Right. Yeah. This leader?
Just one question. How long was the hair?
We don't know how long it would have been. Probably pretty long by that point. There is a point where, the person's hair stops growing, and that's different for each person. But if he hadn't cut it his whole life, it was as long as it was going to get at this point.
I was thinking that the hair was kind of maintained in the size, so as God permits it.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. No? Dave?
Well, I'm kind of puzzled. Well, not very, I guess I should rephrase that. Too many times we get into relationships that are not good to be in, and we refuse to get out of them. Now, I believe that Samson knew a lot more than we really care about. You cannot know right and left. But he refused to get out of it.
Yeah.
And so, could it be that God, that's one of the reasons he's punishing Samson, because he just would not get out of that situation?
Yeah.
He's not supposed to be in that situation.
Right. He shouldn't be involved with Delilah at all. This is the second time we've read of a woman who pushes him and pushes him and pushes him until he finally, tells her what she wants to know. Didn't work out great for him the first time. I don't know why he thinks it. All I can say is women can have an awful lot of power over a man. And that's what's happening here. She's got a lot of power over him, and he is a slave to his lust and a slave to his passions. And he's going to end up dying because of it, ultimately. We're out of time, so next week we're going to explain the end of Samson's life, just how he dies, some remarks on that, and then for sure move on to chapter 17 and 18 with Micah and the Levite. Okay? Any last comments? Okay. Thanks, everyone.